Cenk Uygur did a great interview with Russell Brand, and in the interview, Brand actually laid out his philosophy of government at one point. So I want to take a listen here, and then there's a lot to say about it.
That prevent people rising to the top of the pyramid because there's no pyramid to rise to the top of. And we have an ecological imperative like no time in history because we're rapidly burning up the planet's resources.
So how do you disseminate that power then? How do you disperse it? Is it by partly dispersing the wealth? Is there other ways of doing it?
Well, what I think is wherever possible, take away the incentives of profit. Wherever possible, take away the incentives of profit. And if people, I think this myth that our best and our brightest and our finest are only motivated by money and privilege and comfort, I don't necessarily think that that's true. I think if you need, what I'm talking about is not some misty-eyed, mythical sort of sweet hippiedom. I'm talking about ruthless pragmatism. We have a certain amount of resources, we have a certain amount of people, we have a certain amount of time before the planet expires. Let's get the resources to the people. Let's implement systems that distribute resources fairly. Don't have global trade agreements that mean certain organizations benefit hugely whilst others flounder in poverty. Don't have a system where $30 billion could resolve world hunger forever, and that $30 billion isn't found in spite of the fact that every 8 days $30 billion is spent on arms. That's just silly. That's a silly thing for us to engage in. So I would say collectivization and cooperation, decentralized and deconcentrated power.
Okay, so there's a lot there. A lot of it I agree with, and some of it I disagree with. So the area where I totally agree is where he points out the obvious and what he calls ruthless pragmatism, which is this idea that, well, why the fuck are we spending all this money in the military-industrial complex and where, spending $30 billion on weaponry per day or per week or whatever it is, and then meanwhile, we can cure world hunger for that amount, and we don't. It doesn't even fucking cross our mind. Yeah, that's a problem, and we should flip it, and he's right. We should address that problem, and we should go down that road. But the areas where he loses me a little bit, see, this is where my true colors, as what I often refer to as me being an international centrist or an international moderate, this is where that comes out, okay? And you start to realize I'm not as far left as a guy like Russell Brand. I'm not with the people in the Zeitgeist movement. I'm not even with somebody like Noam Chomsky, who's, of course, a brilliant scholar. I agree with Noam Chomsky's criticism on American foreign policy and imperialism. He's totally right about that. On domestic policy, I kind of disagree with him. And even with, like, Karl Marx, for example, I think his critique of capitalism was brilliant, but I think his proposed solutions were not so brilliant, okay? So, again, I'm an international centrist. I like the social democracies. I like Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Sweden. I think that's a model to essentially almost as good as a society can get with flawed human beings running it. I think maybe we could get a little better than that, but I don't know how much better. I don't believe in a utopia, but I believe in close to a utopia. Listening to a guy like Russell Brand, I think he wants to go further. So where do I disagree? Well, when he says, well, I don't want there to be a pyramid for people to get to the top of. I just want to get rid of the pyramid. I say no, I don't think that coincides with human nature. I think you need the pyramid. I think we're apes, okay? And apes are very tribal by their nature. We should fight against that instinct, but no matter what we do, it's always going to exist to a certain extent. So that's why we have sports, and we love sports. It's, that team versus that team. They're wearing green, they're wearing yellow. Fight, we love it. And war, that's why war still continued to this day. And then also there's religious reasons and political reasons and economic reasons. But we're very tribal, and I think you need some system to harness our greed and our meritocracy. It's in us. There's no doubt about that. I don't want to try to pretend like it's not in us and end up creating a worse system. Okay, so I disagree with that, man. And then here's the biggest disagreement. He says, wherever you can, take away the profit motive. No, I think it's the opposite. I think the default position, since we're, greedy by our nature and we're vicious by our nature, but we're also good people and altruistic by our nature, it's a mixed bag. But I think it's use the profit motive where you can, and just wherever the profit motive shows itself to be too greedy to work, that's when you have government and collectivism step in. Okay, and that's why I always say I'm in favor of universal education, universal health care, even universal daycare, stuff like that. You need regulatory bodies to make sure your food isn't poisoned. You need to create infrastructure, okay? And like I always say, the Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Sweden, those are the places that have nailed it thus far, where they have just the right amount of socialism, which is government, right, and capitalism, which I think harnesses that thing that's within us. Regulate it, give people a shitload of vacation time, do like a 4-day work week, right? That's something I would be in favor of. But this idea that you can kind of scrap everything and be totally collective and get rid of all the institutions and be that extra level of radical, that's where I think certain people on the left lose me. So even though I totally respect Russell Brand, and I think he's a really smart guy, in some areas I slightly disagree with him.